Chapter 3 Westward, Ho! Land ho! Where away? Look out! Right ahead, sir! Land ho! Land ho! The shouts re-echoed cheerily around the decks. It was daylight on the morning of the 19th day at sea, and the Joseph Conrad was slipping quietly along before a gentle northerly breeze that threatened to increase with the growing sun. It had rained in the night, and the morning had a freshness like a new-turned field. All hands were out with the shout of land, Stormalong among them. Though it was his watch below, he scampered up the fore-rigging to the topsail yard, and from there could make out, dimly in the mist ahead, the heights of an island. It was Madeira, the first land they had seen since leaving England. The breeze freshened as the sun rose, and the little ship began to skim gracefully along under all sail, making a steady 8 or 9 knots, and quickly the island came into clear view. It was very high and a long way off, and it was noon before they were close. The boys ran about preparing the ship to come to anchorage, seeing the anchors clear and all the gear, and making the boats ready to lower. This was the first island of the voyage, and all hands were excited, even Chips, the tough carpenter, though he pretended not to be, and Carl, the boatswain, laughed happily as he brushed his blue clothes. Chips was a Finn, Carl a German. "Now we'll soon be on shore, Stormy Sun," said Carl, patting the boy on the head. Storm grinned. The ship came to anchor close in by the land, near the hulk of a big sailing ship, and after some officials had come out to inspect the papers and clear the ship, the crew swung out the boats, and one watch at a time pulled in towards the shore. Although it was calm, there was quite a swell, and they had to be careful putting the lifeboat alongside at the mole. Along the shore they saw the islanders' surf-boats, which were ordinarily used to take people to the land, and immigrants from a Polish steamer, and Frenchmen from a Bordeaux steamer, and sailors and passengers of all nations crowded the cobbled streets. Big sleds, drawn by contented-looking oxen, stood around, some of them going along slowly, with tubs of wine on them, and swarthy men walking alongside, talking to their steeds. The scene was picturesque and animated, and the boys spent a happy afternoon walking the foreign streets, peering in queer shops, examining curios, eating fruit, and climbing hills to look down upon the blue sea, where the ships far below looked like models of themselves that never moved. But the greatest thrill of all was a ride down a steep hillside in a wooden sled, which a man guided with skill as the sled bumped and slid from curve to curve. That was fun. Stormalong and Hardcase had 7 rides. In the evening, after a full day, all hands came back on board again, and the ship sailed. They were all merry and full with good fruit and land food, and though the water was deep and the cable out almost to the end, the boys tramped around the capstan, singing lustily. They sang all the songs they knew, for the heavy job took a long time, and the cable came in heavily, link by link, each link protesting as it rumbled in the hawse. Mocker Moss, down in the chain locker, stowed the cable and was covered with mud. The mate had sent him down there for singing out of tune. Rolling home, away Rio, Sally Brown, Stormalong, all these old songs they sang, again and again, and land songs, because the boys did not know many songs of the sea, and German songs, from Horst and Karl, and Danish songs, and Swedish songs, and Australian songs. And the cable came in merrily. The night was soft, and the wind was quiet, and the little ship took a long time to turn as her anchor was raised and the sail set, with a rattle of blocks and rustle of worn canvas. At last she headed out quietly towards the open sea, and the darkened water turned to white lazily at the old bow, and from the jib boom end, where Stormalong had climbed on his lookout, the pyramids of the tall sails seemed ghost-like and unreal in the soft night air. The big Polish steamer passed close by, her engines whirring powerfully, and at her stern the 3 propellers throbbing, and a burst of music came from her well-lit decks. From the high bridge the voice of a man called, "Goodbye, little ship." Fair winds to you. In the moment of passing, the lights from the steamer shone upon the sailing ship, and the grace of the sails showed splendid in the night. Stormalong looked back from his perch on the jib boom end, and his heart smiled. This was the life. The routine of the ship was quickly re-established, and the days passed pleasantly, and the nights, as the Joseph Conrad's head pointed steadily towards the west, in the wake of Columbus. The ship was bound now from Madeira towards Watling Island in the West Indies, more than 3,000 miles away, and this was almost the identical voyage Columbus had made more than 4 centuries earlier, on the first trade wind crossing of the North Atlantic. The wind now blew steadily from somewhere between east and northeast, so that it was always behind the ship, and she could sail steadily onwards upon her course, and all the gales of the Channel and the Biscay storms seemed never to have had existence. Trade wind jobs were the order of the day. They were 3 weeks without seeing anything except fish, and they never caught any of them except one leathery thing that Jim caught in a bucket, and the cat ate. It was a bucket with a hole in the bottom, and Jim had tied a very old piece of salt horse on to the handle. A leathery little fish sniffed at the horse and fell unconscious in the bucket, or at least that was what Jim said. Nobody else saw it, and after all, he did haul the fish on board in the bucket. He thought it was probably poisonous, and so it was given to the cat, which ate it and lived. Then Jim regretted the generosity and tried to catch some more, but he never did. One trade wind evening, with the ship going quietly along before a nice breeze, the boys thought it would be a good idea to help her speed if they lashed the sailmaker's blankets to the radio spreader above the main royal yard, where they would make an excellent sky sail. No sooner thought of than done, but the sailmaker didn't think so much of the idea. He chased them for hours around the deck, and when at last he caught them, put the pair of them across his knee, but it was good fun. In the evenings, with the day's work done, the boys mostly gathered up on the forecastle head, or along the spare spar, and yarned. American boys told tales of life in American schools, and on Arizona ranches, of swimming from Californian beaches, and horse riding in Texas, of winter sports in the Adirondacks, and on Canada's frozen lakes. English boys talked of the fields of England and of schools, and now and again a grain ship sailor would reel off a yarn of swift sailing off Cape Horn, and storms and gales and doldrum calms. The days passed pleasantly, and the life of the ship was peaceful, and day after day the boys thrived, and learned, and grew strong, muscled, tanned, alert, and capable. In the Sargasso Sea, the ship was becalmed for many days. By the time a month out from Madeira, that the small island of San Salvador at last showed up ahead, all hands were pleased to see land again. Watling Island was a low kind of place, not very exciting. I dunno what Columbus got so excited about, looking at that place, said Stormalong. He thought it was America, said Hardcase. Go on. How could he think it was America, when nobody'd been to America then? Put in the mocker, mocking as usual. He thought it was China or some place. Well, it doesn't look like China much to me, said Twitter Twynham, unrolling his long length from a bunk. And I've never been to China either, and it doesn't look like America to me, said David, a red-headed, freckled-faced boy from Massachusetts, who wasn't a bad sort, mostly. Well, it's Watling Island anyway, and I hope we can get ashore there. Stormalong concluded the brief argument. In this hope he was disappointed, for the weather soon changed very much for the worse, and the little ship had to fight hard against a succession of swiftly changing storms to get away from that area, and the captain stood on toward Nassau, the principal port of the Bahamas. The ship had been 35 days at sea from Madeira before the lights of Nassau were at last in sight, and late that night she anchored. Chapter 4. In the Bahamas. Nassau was a low, flat place, hot and sandy, but very interesting to the boys. Stormalong and Hardcase, on their first day's leave, took a little pony cart driven by a big buck negro and drove all around. It was the first time they had seen Negroes, and they were very interested in them. They liked to listen to their picturesque speech and to hear them sing. Groups of minstrels came on board singing songs, and they were happy to sing on the forecastle head all night for their suppers. Massa take dis Gary, very good Gary, I drive you good cheap. Don't you believe one word that nigger says, Massa? Take dis extra special first class Gary, hey, drives you for the half ob what dat feller charges. Massa, take dis glass bottom boat, see de coral and all de fishes of de rock gardens, very good cheap. Don't you believe dat old nigger, Massa? Take dis extra special glass bottom boat, hey, the biggest and the best glass bottom in the whole West Indies. I reckon we'll take a look at all these sponge fishing schooners first before we go in anybody's pony cart, said Storm to his shipmate. By the time we've walked away a bit, their prices will be way down anyway. Good idea too, Hardcase replied, and the two boys walked round the colorful wharves where the small schooners lay, moored with their sterns to the quay, discharging sponges and taking in queer cargoes. After they had walked around here for quite a while and had seen all there was to see, they took a pony taxi with a cheerful Negro and drove to the colored quarter and up to the big fort, where British soldiers in old-fashioned uniforms kept guard. The streets were filled with Negroes and with tourists, and big airplanes full of men with golf sticks landed on the harbor. Nassau was a holiday place, and a pretty good one too. When the boys took a trip in a glass-bottomed boat over the coral gardens, they wondered at the beauties spread before them. From the boat, the whole of the bottom of which amidships was strong glass, they could peer down into the clear depths, where wonderful formations of coral made lovely gardens, and multicolored fish swam swiftly here or there, or browsed lazily like sea cows chewing their cuds. The wonder of this beauty was something they had not seen before, nor ever imagined. and they gazed and gazed at a loss for words. Twitter was with them on this trip, and even Twitter said nothing once for 5 minutes at a stretch. "Gosh," said Storm at last, "there's nothing like that in Ipswich." "Even." "You'd bet there isn't," from Twitter. "No, and there isn't in Yorkshire either." "Well," said Hard with some belligerence, "there isn't, and there isn't likely to be." "No, well, there's better things in Yorkshire than blooming fish," declared Twitter with some heat. "You, for instance," put in Stormalong. "Only you left." "They threw him out," said Hard. "Well, maybe they've got some sense then. Maybe. Come on, Twitter, don't get your back up. There's worse fellers in Yorkshire than you, I'll bet." "Hope I never meet 'em," said the sarcastic Hard. "You'll meet a good sock on the jaw pretty soon." Twitter was getting angry. "Yes, from who?" Hard was forgetting his grammar. "From me. You and who else?" "Me and nobody else." "Oh, yes?" "Yes. You couldn't sock my old aunt, not you and your whole blooming family, and my aunt's 80 next birthday." "Are you chaps going crazy or something?" said the peaceful Stormalong. "Trying to start a fight here in a small boat in the West Indies? Come on, wake up and behave, even if it is unnatural." "He began it," said Hard with some surliness. Twitter started to say something properly sarcastic, but just then a big shark swam into view, and the three boys forgot their temporary brush. Brief arguments of that kind were always coming up, of course, and they did not mean anything except that Hardcase and Stormalong thought Ipswich was the best place on earth. They were born there, weren't they? Twitter thought Yorkshire was because he had been born there. These views were irreconcilable. Besides, all the other boys had been born somewhere else, and every place on earth couldn't be the best place in the world. But each boy thought it was. They ate 5 ice creams each afterwards, and peace reigned in the land. Big, luscious ice creams, washed down with strawberry sodas that were pretty good. Then they had a meal of fish and chips, and meat pies, and more ice cream and fruit. After that they looked for a really good restaurant where they could have a feed. Nearly all of the cadets showed up at the same place, in a little side street, where they ate so much and so heartily that the proprietress was mightily glad to see them go. Stormalong had a big plate of steak and eggs as an appetizer, and after that some steak and kidney pie, which was his favorite, and then suet pudding with golden syrup sauce, and lots of fresh bread and fresh butter all the way through. Hardcase had 4 plates of ham and eggs for his appetizer, and for his meal 3 plates of steak and kidney pie. Twitter stuck to roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, of which he ate all there was in the cafe. "I'm glad I don't feed you boys every day," said the poor waitress. "My, what's that ship of yours loaded with? Just food." "That's the trouble," said Twitter. "She isn't." "Well, she will be when you boys get back on board again," rejoined the girl. To that even Twitter could think of no reply, although he did suggest that they had better beef in Yorkshire. But he did not say much. His mouth was too full for the first 2 hours, and after that his stomach was. Twitter was at the wheel when the ship went to sea, but that was only because the mate didn't see him go there. However, the ship stayed somehow in the channel, and there was a good fair wind outside. The first day of the run towards New York was pleasant enough. The sun shone, and the wind blew good and fresh, and the little ship reeled off 200 miles. The boys had heard a lot about New York, and looked forward to reaching that big port. They had been delayed several hours in Nassau because Slobber and his hench mate Titus Gilpin got themselves mixed up in an accident with a horse. They said they were walking down the street and a horse bumped into them, but the boys did not believe that. Titus was a bit of a queer fish. He loved to smoke at a huge pipe, even in his sleep, and he wore the strangest clothes. He admitted afterwards they'd been racing along the sands, and Slobber's horse tripped and fell on him. It rolled on him once. What, only once, was Hardcase's comment. It should have been more than that. There was general agreement on this point. Not that the boys didn't like old Jollop, who, as sea cooks go, might have been much worse, but they blamed him every time the food was not entirely to their liking, and this was rather often. Slobber did his best with the food the ship supplied, but this was of necessity somewhat tough salt meat, and dried stock fish, and ancient potatoes, and pea soup, and so forth. For the first 2 days after leaving Nassau, Slobber was laid up. The steward cooked, and the food was better, but the boys moaned even more. Stormalong didn't moan very much. He ate what was put before him, though he had been fussy enough at home, and if he missed fish and chips, and meat pies, and such delicacies, he did not say very much. He was too happy just to be in the ship. From Nassau the ship sailed pleasantly northwards for a week, but then the weather quickly changed, and the wind swung to the northwest, blowing violently. It set up a great sea, which drove over the vessel, turning the water to ice wherever it touched the iron work, and it was purgatory to work on the open decks. The wind was ahead, and the ship had to beat, and beat, and beat, with never a let-up either, in the force or direction of the wind. So Christmas came, and passed, and the ship beat on. The boys saw many steamers waddling by, throwing the seas half over themselves as they thrust their stodgy bows into the Atlantic. 10 days after leaving the Bahamas port, David showed Stormalong a blinking light. "That's Ambrose," he said. "Ambrose who?" asked Storm. "Ambrose, nobody goat. That's the light outside New York." "That's a funny name to call a light," was Stormalong's comment, as he shivered in all his clothes. Chapter 5. On the Rocks. Storm, storm, wake up there, lively now. Clatter of excited footsteps down the 'tween decks. Companion shouts, running of sea-booted feet over the main deck, awakened the sleeping boys. Rubbing his eyes, Storm murmured dreamily, "What's the matter? Where in port aren't we? What's all the rush?" "Rush enough. Come on now, out of that bunk. The ship's driving on the rocks." The watchman yelled at the maul to roll out at once before the ship struck, and still bewildered and thinking it was all a dream, Storm, Hard, Twitter, Mocker, and the rest of them rolled sleepily from their bunks. Even as he turned out, Storm could sense, from the difference in the ship's motion, that something was wrong. Only the previous day they had at last come to anchorage. After the Atlantic crossing, it was a holiday, New Year's Day, and with a watchman on deck and the third mate in charge, all hands had turned in for a good night's rest. The ship was anchored safely on the Bay Ridge Flats, near the Narrows of New York Harbor, with the great apartment houses and the crowded streets of Brooklyn on the one hand, and the wharves and hills of Staten Island on the other. It had seemed the safest place in the world, but now the ship, driven from her moorings, was in grave danger. Stormalong hurried into his clothes and rushed on deck. There he could see the shore lights of Brooklyn coming closer and closer. The wind howled in the rigging, and the ship, bare of sails, was drifting rapidly with a sluggish motion, as if she did not like to be doing what she was, as if she knew she should have been lying to a secure anchor, instead of barging about that crowded harbor in the middle of the night. Up forward, the third mate and a gang of the grain ship sailors were working with the windlass and the spare anchor, but the forecastle head was a mass of ice. It was freezing cold, and the wind was savage. It drove spray high over the little ship, even in the harbor, and the deck was too slippery to stand on. "Up here and lend a hand there, you boys," shouted the mate. Stormalong and Hardcase rushed for the forecastle head, and slipped sprawling on the deck, Storm wrenching one of his knees on a steel bollard. As he rolled over and tried to gain his footing again, the ship struck hard at first, with her iron side against a rock. Then she settled down gently against the rocks, and the sea spray, whipped by the harbor gale, drove over her. Storm heard the scrunching, heard the rending of the protesting iron plates, sensed the deadness that came over the poor ship, a feeling he had never known before. It seemed even to his senses that were dulled and numb with the cold, that the ship was like a human thing that had been foully mistreated by the gale. But there was little time to think. "Get your life jackets on," ordered the mate, in a quiet voice. "Get your life jackets, you boys, and stand by the gangway aft. There's no danger." The boys knew where the life jackets were. In the hammock netting by the gangways aft, on both sides. They went there and put on jackets of cork and canvas, while the ship rose and fell on the rocks. Stormalong could see now that she was lying with her starboard side along the rocks. Off the shore rode sea wall of the Brooklyn shore. She rose and fell uneasily with the seaway there, and each time she fell there came a scrunch of the plates on the rocks. She was obviously holed badly. "I'm going to see about my clothes," yelled Mocker, with his life jacket on. "Down to the 'tween decks, fellers. We'll save what we can." There was a rush to the 'tween deck companion, and Mocker jumped down. The lights, which had been left burning a few moments earlier, were out. In a second the boys heard Mocker spluttering and yelling. He had fallen into the water. The 'tween deck was already full, and all the boys' belongings were beneath the sea. The ship lay close enough to the safety of the ice-covered ground for the boys to be able to see it clearly, even through the snow, and they could see the street lamps of the shore road shining. But the vessel was rolling dangerously, and it seemed that at any one of the rolls she might go over, fall outwards into the black, gale-whipped waters of the bay. Stormalong shivered as he thought of this. He'd heard of the many kinds of shipwrecks, but this was a new variety. To be wrecked like that right in the crowded waters of a harbor. It was just cold and miserable and worrying, and there was nothing exciting about it in the least. And there were all his possessions swimming about in the hold. "What happened?" asked Twitter, shivering with the cold. "I mean, the ship's ashore, isn't she?" "You're telling us," said Hard. "She broke the cable in a squall," said the watchman. "It was so quick nothing could be done." The boys shivered and gathered round the galley, where Slobberjollop was trying to light a fire, but the spray had frozen in there too, and the fire refused to burn. It was several hours to daylight, and the boys waited miserably. There was nothing to be done. Stormalong had got his feet in the water of the main 'tween decks, and now his legs felt like 2 blocks of ice inside his rubber sea boots. Hardcase had only a thin suit, and all his other clothes were lost. But the quarters that belonged to Jan and the other sailors were all right, and they handed out some good warm clothes to the younger boys. The mate tried to get a plank out to the shore, but it was too far, and the ship worked on the rocks too much. But there was no danger. Even if she fell over into the harbor, she could not sink. Before very long, a Coast Guard cutter, a motorboat about 50 feet long came by, shining her searchlight, and police radio patrol cars came down the road with a screaming of sirens. With the breaking of the cold day, they saw that, that the wreck was not so bad as it might have seemed. The ship had settled then, and the wind was quieter, and if it had not been so bitterly cold, the adventure might even have been exciting. But Stormalong felt by then that his feet were 2 blocks of ice. Somebody had screwed onto his legs by mistake, and the driving snow added to the general misery. The ship was not then more than 20 feet out from the sea wall, and the tide was falling so that some of the rocks were exposed. As the tide fell, Slobber Jollop and the steward dropped down from the channels on to the rocks, and it was an easy matter for some of the sailors to take a Jacob's ladder ashore and scale the face of the sea wall. Then communication was established, and the younger boys at orders went ashore. They'd only be in the way, the mate said, and there was a lot of work to do. He told them to go to a shelter by the ferry pier close by and get what warmth they could. They still had their life jackets on, and by that time some people were beginning to come down to look at the strange sight of a sailing ship ashore. More and more people came to stand and stare, and an airplane flew overhead with some men hanging out of it, taking pictures. A man in a passing tug put in at the ferry wharf and gave the shivering boys some coffee, for which they were heartily thankful, and then some kind-hearted policemen took them up to the station to dry out and drink more coffee and eat some fresh hot rolls. It was the first time Stormalong had been ashore, and once his frozen feet began to feel as if they belonged to him again, he began to like it. He was still dressed in his rough sailor's clothes, blue jersey and woolen cap, and rough sarge trousers and sea boots. He had neither coat nor gloves, but the loss of his clothes did not worry him. At any rate, they weren't really lost yet. He knew where they were. They were at the bottom of the harbor, in the Joseph Conrad's 'tween decks. The only thing that worried him was the thought that perhaps the ship would be damaged so badly that the voyage would be abandoned, and he would have to go home. That was a bitter thought. "Gosh, Jim," he said, "I hope she can be fixed up." "You bet she can," said the cheerful hard case. "That's nothing. I've seen ships worse off than that, right in the River Orwell, and I've seen 'em worse than that on the Yorkshire coast." Chipped in the Twitter unasked, "I've seen ships more damaged than any you've ever seen, hard case, I'll bet." "You'll get damaged worse than you've ever been, Twitter Twynham, if you don't shut up about that blooming Yorkshire coast," yelled Hard. "I'll bet you've never seen a ship damaged in your whole blooming life. Oh no, oh no, oh yes, oh yes. And how many have you seen, Mr. Know-all, Ipswich, hard case, ha? More'n you'd seen, more'n you'll ever know about, more'n there's ever been in all blooming Yorkshire and the north of England beside. And don't you say anything about Ipswich either. Well, don't you say anything about Yorkshire. Gosh, Jim, here's the ship on the rocks in New York, and you and Twitter argue about two good places 3,000 miles away. Put in the peacemaking storm. I vote we need our energies for more things than that. Where are we going to eat, anyway? That is important, Hardcase agreed, and even Twitter could see the point. At that moment, Mocker came in. He looked very disheveled, wet, and dirty, but he could still grin. Mocker had two dog's teeth that showed over his lower lip, so that even when he was asleep, he still seemed to be grinning. Maybe he was. If he ever caught sight of his own face, he'd have to grin. The captain says us three have got to go with some friends of his near here, said Mocker. What three from Twitter? Not you, anyway. Hard Storm and me. You fight too much. You've got to stay in the police station. Oh yes? Ha, you can tell these coppers about Yorkshire, grinned Hardcase. See if they care. Twitter subsided into silence. Where's these friends? Asked Storm. Come on and let's get going, says me. I could do with a feed. The captain's friends were outside, waiting for the three boys. They were a Norwegian family who lived in a little street close to where the ship had gone ashore, and they took off the three boys with a much greater cheerfulness than they would have dared possess if they had known them better. Storm, Hard, and Mocker were in luck. They were put up in warm rooms in a cozy brick house, where there were good warm baths and lots of body-filling food and music, and down in the big warm cellar a furnace where they could dry their clothes, and lots of room for skylarking and play. True, after a week or so, they were a bit of a strain on their good-natured hosts, but the furniture was good and strong, and nothing suffered very much. The boys did their best to behave, and the girls of the household, calling in ample droves of help from amongst their pleasant acquaintance, took them around and showed them New York, while the ship was pulled off the rocks and moved to dry dock for repairs, knocking down a pier and all but sinking on the way. Storm, Hard, and Mocker mooned about, looking at museums and skyscrapers and such things, trudging miles through city sleet and snow, and traveling in the warm and crowded subways. What a strange place New York was! At first it was rather frightening to emerge from a subway station into the welter of traffic, all hurrying somewhere, taxicabs, cars, people. People, people, people everywhere. Crowded subways, crowded streets, crowded shops, crowded restaurants, crowded cinemas. In the trains, it was impossible even to move 1 foot, at least in the rush hours, and most hours seemed to be rush hours, but Storm and the other boys were always so intensely interested in the amazing variety of the faces round them that they never noticed the discomfort. In any Brooklyn subway car at any given time, there seemed to be at least 20 different nationalities, and at least 10 men with faces like murderers. Maybe they were quite kind-hearted, really, but they did not look it. Some of the faces almost scared Stormalong, but nothing scared Mocker. He looked pretty tough himself. And the huge buildings. Sometimes in the early days the boys came back with pains in their necks from looking up so much. They went up to the top of the Empire State Building on Fifth Avenue and looked down at the people 1,000 feet below crawling like ants, and the taxicabs like tiny toys, and away in the distance the snow-covered hills of Long Island and the Jersey coastline and Staten Island, and in the middle of the harbor the bronze-green figure of Liberty. It was an amazing place, and the air was stimulating. Still, they missed old Twitter a bit, and he would doubtless have been able to point to numerous deficiencies that would not have been evident in Yorkshire. But Twitter was by that time back on board. At length a message came to the house that the boys were to report back on board for duty. The ship was off dry dock, where her hull had been repaired, but there was still a great deal to do before she could go to sea. She had not been badly damaged by the grounding, after all, but it was a month before she was ready to continue the voyage. When the time came at last to sail, the 3 boys were sorry to go. They were glad enough to be going to sea again, and tremendously relieved that the ship was comparatively little hurt, but they had grown to like their stay in New York, and the Norwegian girls had been more than kind to them. Their friends came down to see them off, and on the cold afternoon that the little ship sailed. "I wonder if we could ask the captain to carry girls," suggested Mocker as the ship, under plain sail, went out, past the Brooklyn shore. He said it, though, as if he didn't really mean it. Hardcase and Stormalong stared. "What's got into you?" they said together. "I dunno. Girls is not so bad," said Mocker with a sigh. "Huh, women," commented Stormalong without enthusiasm. "Besides, there'll be plenty girls in the next port we come to." But he was mighty sorry to leave New York, just the same.